Okay, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. Welcome you to the second part in this review of the series on rabbinic assessments of Herzl's role in Jewish history. The series is sponsored by Dr. Solomon Langerman in honor of Rina's parents, and with the prayer that Misha Ana, L'chanani Misha v'Azariah, V'sech kivshana eshu ya'anenu. Tonight's second part is sponsored specifically by Nathan and Beth Adler, commemorating the 40th yahrzeit of Nathan's grandmother, Rachel Adler, Aleh HaShalom. And we express appreciation to the Frankel family for making possible the recording of these lectures. So our discussion has been about rabbinic assessments of Herzl's role in Jewish history. Theodor Herzl, the father of the Zionist movement, it so happens his birthday was yesterday, 159th birthday if I'm not mistaken, and the father of modern Zionism, of political Zionism, who himself, certainly as he began that movement, was not an observant Jew, a traditional Jew, was a Jew who came from a much more assimilated background, much discussion and debate about the exact nature of that background and the level of connection or non-connection which he may have had. But clearly his approach in the Zionist dream, the Zionist ideal which he created, was not primarily religiously driven. It was driven as Jewish nationalism. It was driven as a response, as what he saw as the only viable response to anti-Semitism. And of course, so much about his program offended certain religious sensibilities. Last week we talked about the reaction of two rabbinic personalities, both of whom started off in their lives with the same reaction, but one who took a radical turn. And that reaction was one of opposition because of the daring to try to bring about a messianic redemption by the hands of man, when in fact that would be something which we would expect. Our prayers and all of the direction in Jewish life has been waiting for the geula, for the redemption to come by the hands of God. They invoked the passage in the Gemara in the end of Maseches Ksubos, which speaks about the oaths that Hashem applied to the Jewish people and to the world, that we shouldn't take matters into our own hands. Shelo yalu b'chomor k'chomo. We should not go up to Jerusalem, to Eretz Yisrael together as a group, as a wall. We shouldn't rebel against the nations of the world, even as the nations of the world are asked not to over-oppress us. To take this into our own hands, to arrogate for ourselves the initiative to change things, that was something which was going against, again, the typical, the classic Jewish sensibilities. We learned last week the Torah, the tshuva of the Minchas HaLozar, the Munkat Sharav, his response to this movement, citing in his explanation of the Rambam's omission of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and explaining that it was for this very reason, because of this limitation which is upon the Jewish people, that we're not able to ascend to Eretz Yisrael, we're not able to go and take back the land without a prophet, without an instruction directly from Hashem, and those kinds of things are not put in the mitzvahs. They're not put amongst the Taryag mitzvahs. That reticence. And at the same time, there was also the discomfort with the lack of observance amongst those who were leading the movement. If this was on any level to be redemption, should it be through these hands? If you recall, the Minchas HaLozar even suggested that even were it to be a mitzvah, even in the conception of the Ramban, that it's a mitzvah to return. But he had his doubts about whether the Ramban would want to do it now when it had been assumed under the leadership of those who were not consistent with the faith. Comparing it to the Matseva that was once beloved to Hashem, but no longer was. So that's a little bit of what we talked about last week. And it's a remarkable thing to see that those attitudes, precisely those attitudes, that were found there in the world of the Munkacher and the Satmarov, and originally in the thinking of the Eim Habonim Samecha, who came from that same school of thought, that those exact sentiments were expressed by Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, who is the grandfather of the personality that we're going to be discussing today, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Breuer, who was one of the leaders of German Orthodoxy, and who himself ultimately made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael in the 1930s. The grandfather of Rav Hirsch, the Rabbi Dr. Breuer's father was Shlomo Breuer, Rabbi Solomon Breuer, who was the successor of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, and his son, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Breuer, would be the head of Agudas Yisrael. And it is his reaction we're going to study today. But let's start by looking at the words of his own grandfather. His grandfather was in some limited correspondence with Ratzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Ratzvi Hirsch Kalischer was a significant rabbinic personality in the 19th century who was one of the fathers of the movement of the Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion, a religious movement of people who wanted to settle Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Chovevei Tzion was not just a religious movement. It ended up merging different streams. But Rav Kalischer was a father of the movement from the religious side. And he, in fact, wrote a sefer, which, very interestingly, the Rav Teichtal, the Eim Habonim Smecha, who we mentioned last week, after he wrote the sefer, he came across the sefer Drishas Tzion of Rav Kalischer, and said, he says a lot of the ideas that I said myself. And he actually publishes some of the, in the Haskamos, in the approbations for his own work, he borrows from that which was given to the work of Rav Kalischer because he saw the works as being so connected to each other. So Rav Kalischer gave his sefer, gave his book, sent a few copies to Rav Hirsch for him himself, and to share with some important personalities there in Germany. And evidently, he wrote a follow-up letter to Rav Hirsch after some time, a little bit annoyed perhaps that he thought Rav Hirsch hadn't done his mission. And Rav Hirsch responds, also not sounding so thrilled. And he says, "You've blamed me for two things, of which I am not guilty. The Svarim that you sent me 2 years ago, I did what you told me. One I gave to the Baron, the Rothschild that is here, and the other, the rest, I gave into the hands of the bookseller, Kaufman, that he should do what you asked of him. And in fact, I even wrote to you that I did this, but evidently you didn't get the letter. So, first of all, I did what you asked me to do." But then, writes Rav Hirsch, "And if perhaps I am too small-minded to recognize the good and the truth that will blossom, according to your great opinion, from all of your efforts with regard to the settlement of the land, and that you think that this is all a mitzvah and an obligation, to my mind, I don't see it that way. In my humble opinion, that I have no involvement with nistoros, with hidden secrets, it would seem to me that our way to follow is the path which has already been well trodden by our forefathers, that they did not do anything other than to try in every which way to strengthen ourselves in the pathway of Torah before God, to remove the obstacles from within ourselves, and to yearn for the redemption each and every day, im bekolo nishma, if we listen to God's voice. Our hishtadlus, our effort to bring about the redemption, is the effort to be better Jews. We never put on our own selves, on our own shoulders, to try to clear the path to Geula by trying to prepare the physical Holy Land. Rather, we did it by trying to fix and prepare our own hearts and our own actions to make them better. So, classic, says Rav Hirsch, we don't make material efforts to be able to get there. We make spiritual efforts internally that are not focused specifically on trying to ascend to the land. They're focused on doing the right thing. We don't get involved with trying to take it with our own hands. And if you see, Rav Kalisher saw, that the fact that there were barons and dukes and important people, wealthy, prominent people who had the ear of great kings and kaisers and who knows, who were Jews. So he says, there also, I'm not quite ready to say that, as you do, seeing in that some kind of seeds of Geula, of redemption, I don't see it. I don't see it. Because after all, these people who you're speaking about, who are so influential, who can quote-unquote make such a difference, im chadoshim porke el hadas yimnu. They are to be counted amongst the reformers, those who have removed from themselves from the yoke of mitzvahs, of the yoke of our faith. V'ukesi b'sanverim, and I have been blinded from being able to imagine in my heart that it will be these people that God would choose to be His emissaries. To be His emissaries in order to be able to bring the redemption. And he goes on in this letter. So what do you see here? The two precise objections that were found from the Minchas Elazar, from the Satmar, from other traditional Jews. One, that we're not supposed to take matters in our own hands. Redemption is supposed to come in the hands of God. And even were one to imagine that we should be doing something, but to see, to expect that it would be amongst these people who are far from the faith, that they would be the shluchim, the messengers that Hashem would choose in order to make this happen, Rav Hirsch found that stretched his imagination. He could not accept it. He couldn't believe it. That was Rav Hirsch's rejection of it. It's not a one-time thing that he did in a letter to Rav Kalisher. We note that in Rav Hirsch's Siddur, there are many examples and many places where he does this, but in one example, readily notable, is in Rav Hirsch's commentary on the Siddur. Tka b'shofar gadol l'cheiruseinu. We ask Hashem to sound the shofar for our redemption. Writes Rav Hirsch. But such a reunion cannot be brought about by human action, or even only through the intermediary of human effort. We must wait for God Himself to sound the shofar. Even as an individual can hope for Geula only after he has first passed through the stages of Das, Tshuva, and Slicha, so our people can expect collective Geula only after all of us have reacquired for ourselves the only true perspective of things, Das, and after we have all returned to His law and to His faithful service, so as to be deserving of forgiveness and pardon. Any allegation that deliverance can be obtained by other means than those is nothing but dangerous folly. Rav Hirsch people would say that Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, German Jewish Jewry, was anti-Zionist. And yes, as expressed here, it certainly was. And in a great sense, you could say about Rabbi Dr. Isaac Breuer that he was also, in a great sense, anti-Zionist. He would say so. He would have told you so. Well, he was a certain kind of anti-Zionist, that's for sure. I'll read to you a little bit about what he himself says. He describes in his own autobiographical discussions, he describes the atmosphere in the home in which he himself grew up. He describes Eretz Yisrael in the mindset of his own father. He describes and says, if anyone ever heard my father reading the Kinos of Tisha B'Av, he knew that there wasn't standing before him a Hungarian or a German from the Jewish faith who's fulfilling his obligation to mourn that his faith instructed him to do. But rather, he would see that in front of him is a Yehudi Le'umi, a nationalistic Jew, in the truest meaning of what that term means, without any distortion, that is crying with tzlilim mizazeim, with echoes that cause one to shake, the ache, the pain of his people and the pain of his God, his king, on their distance from each other for 2,000 years. A fundamental sense of loss that was based on a sense of nationalism. And therefore, he says, when Theodor Herzl cried out for the first time in the ears of the Jews of Western Europe, who were scared to death of his call, as were scared many faithful Jews, that they are all part of a nation, even though it was a suffering nation. When Herzl declared such a thing as Jewish nationalism, he says, to me, it was, in fact, nothing fundamentally new. So where we're going here, what I want to share with you is the highly nuanced picture which is painted by Isaac Breuer. Now, like in any good sugya, like in any good historical subject, people have a tendency to paint things and like to paint things in the broadest of strokes. And people come at things, at issues, with their own prejudices, one way or the other. And if I can give a little bit of a break here, a little bit of an interruption, to give what is a classic example of this in the story of Herzl. Herzl had a visit to Eretz Yisrael. We mentioned it last time. He visited Eretz Yisrael in November of 1898. And his visit to Eretz Yisrael was timed to coincide with the visit of Kaiser Wilhelm. He wanted to meet him there. It wouldn't be the first time that they would meet. He wanted to continue to plead for his help, for his intervention. And they came to Yerushalayim. Herzl was coming to Yerushalayim. He arrived in Yerushalayim on a Friday. Actually, he arrived in Yerushalayim on a Friday night. And I want to read to you, for starters, an account of Herzl coming to Yerushalayim on a Friday night, as described in a biography called Ha'ish al HaChoma, a biography of Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, written not by Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, it's not an autobiography, but written by a family member who evidently had no love lost for Herzl. In those days of Tishrei, 1898, when Herzl first appeared in the gates of Yerushalayim, in that Yerushalayim, that lofty Yerushalayim, that the air of its that would be inhaled of its atmosphere, the life of purity, filled its alleyways and its neighborhoods. The Yerushalayim of Rav Shmuel Salant, who would rush from his house when he would hear the terrible breach that somebody was sitting without a yarmulke on his head. And he himself would go to try to address that breach. To that holy city, pure city, enwrapped in its glory and its mystery, appeared the person who had been given the title King of the Jews. And he appeared without a yarmulke on his head, and specifically on Shabbos. And so testifies one of the historians of our time in his essay, The Yerushalayim Dream of Herzl. On the night of the 28th of November, it was actually the 28th of October, but you can't trust anything you read in the newspapers, of 1898, a Jew who was mitbolel, an assimilated Jew, inhabitant, a citizen of Vienna, stepped for the first time in his life on the land of our city Yerushalayim, which was then a poor, neglected city in the Middle East. Theodor Herzl was his name. When he arrived in the train that brought him to Yerushalayim, there was a bright moonlight over the city that was already experiencing the tranquility of Shabbos. Through this light, Theodor Herzl gazed for the first time on the walls of Yerushalayim, on the Mount of Olives, on David's Citadel, Metzudas David, on Har Zion. They appeared on this night to him to be completely enrobed again in glory, something that was surreal. Well, as opposed to Herzl, who saw Yerushalayim when he appeared there for the first time through this bright moonlight that created all of these frightening shadows and so on, mysterious shadows, at that time the sages and the residents of Yerushalayim saw the Zionist prophet, in quotation marks, that dared to appear like a savior, carrying this vision of redemption and the restoration of the Jewish people in their land, at the same time that he is trampling with arrogance on the sanctity of Shabbos, of the city that despite its poverty and despite its oppression was radiating the rest of Shabbos in its courtyards and its alleyways, and that its light of Shabbos was shining forth from every window and every nook in the neighborhoods of the Jews. In Herzl's diary, he wrote about his visit in the Holy City. When I remember those days of my coming to Yerushalayim, it's not with pleasant feelings that I will remember. And it is with far less pleasant feelings that the residents of Yerushalayim of those days will remember this one who dared to bring redemption to the people, even as he was laying ruin to its sanctified values and its glorious, glorious culture. That's the account, the way it is found here. Now let me read to you a somewhat different account of exactly the same story. Herzl's train was scheduled to arrive 2 hours before Shabbat, but it was an hour late leaving Jaffa and further delayed making its way up the mountains. It was supposed to come on time. Upon recognizing that the train would not make it in time for Shabbos, Herzl began to feel unwell. As he wrote in his diary, his fever increased as we went into Shabbat. When the train finally arrived, dark was setting in, and Herzl's first moments in Jerusalem were on Shabbat. His ailment did not stop his decision to walk to the hotel instead of taking a carriage in observance of the day of rest. Located by what is now Davidka Square was a long walk away, and some of his travel companions tried to dissuade him from walking. One of them, David Shuv, reflected, as we walked from the station to town, I saw Herzl didn't have the strength to walk. I told him that since he was sick, he was allowed to travel by carriage. But Herzl would not under any circumstances agree to ride the carriage and violate Shabbat. Even after I clarified that as a sick person there would be no violation of Shabbat, he replied immediately, this is my first time in Jerusalem, the holy city. I will not ride. Herzl walked toward Jaffa Gate on today's Hebron Road, leaning on his cane in one arm and on the shoulder of one of his companions on the other. He turned left to Jaffa Road toward his hotel. The intense excitement of being in Jerusalem apparently gave him strength. Isn't that amazing? One of them says he's coming. He couldn't care less about Shabbos, trampling arrogantly on the Shabbos. And the other one says he wanted to come before Shabbos, but his train was delayed. And he was mamish getting sick over the fact that his train was delayed. And by the time he got there, he was sick. And they said, no, you're allowed to take a taxi. You're allowed to take a carriage. No, it's my first Shabbos in Yerushalayim, Ira Kodesh. Will the real story please stand up? So we actually happen to have the real story. At least what Herzl felt was the real story. Because in Herzl's diary, he writes the following. We then took the train in the frightful heat to Jerusalem. It took an hour merely to leave the Jaffa station. They were an hour delayed. Sitting in the cramped, crowded, burning hot compartment was pure torture. While crossing the dismal and desolate countryside, I began to develop a fever. He was late, he was tired, he was a sickly man, he died very young, lo aleinu, and grew more feverish and weaker as we rode further into the Sabbath. Now, Was he getting sick because they were driving into the Shabbos? That's not what he says. He says he got sick. And as time went on and they were driving into the Shabbos, his fever got worse. For because of the delay in our departure and to Wolfson's positive despair, we found ourselves traveling on the Sabbath. Herzl's travel companion, one of his travel companions, Wolfson, who would succeed him as the head of the Zionist agency, was a frum Jew. And he was upset himself that they were riding on Shabbos, to Wolfson's despair. We arrived at Jerusalem under a full moon. I would have gladly driven the half-hour's distance from the station to our hotel. But the gentleman made such sour faces that I had to resign myself, down with fever as I was, to walking to the city. I literally tottered along on my cane, while with the other hand I braced myself alternately on Wolfson's or Shub's arm. Shub is the one who was quoted saying that I'm not going to do this on my first Shabbos in Yerushalayim. In spite of my weariness, Jerusalem and its grand moonlit contours made a deep impression on me. The silhouette of the fortress of Zion, the citadel of David, magnificent. The streets were alive with Jews sauntering in the moonlight. ... He describes his sickness. So what's the truth? Surprise, surprise. The truth is somewhere in the middle. He didn't have disregard for Shabbos. He didn't want to, in the face of the Jewish people, trample arrogantly on the Shabbos. The opposite. He saw that it would displease people, would make people uncomfortable. So he said, look, I'm here, I'm walking in, I'm here trying to rally the Jewish people behind the cause. I'm going to do something that's going to be so offensive to people. I'm not going to do it. Was it because of his sense, it's the Kedusha of Shabbos, the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, how can I do it? Not really. That's not the sense which we get from him. But at the same time, there was a respect. There was a respect for it. There's nuance to that. It means he wasn't this profoundly internally religious person, like people in one camp would like to somehow read into the story. He was not this horrible anti-religious person who was trying to destroy the religion and trample and trounce anything of it, like another side would choose to destroy. He was coming in. His motivations were not exactly religious, they were nationalistic, but he had respect for the faith, even if it wasn't coming from internal commitment. I would gladly ridden a half hour from the station to our hotel, but he didn't want to offend. That's squarely in the middle, and that's nuance. And I share this with you not only because it's pretty fascinating, but also because it's a good introduction to what we're going to find here in the world of Rabbi Dr. Isaac Breuer, who is an admirer and an opponent of Herzl. A tremendous admirer of something which Herzl did, and a tremendous opponent of something which Herzl did. And the subject really is Jewish nationalism. Because Breuer, Rabbi Dr. Breuer, like his grandfather of Shamshon Foel Hirsch, was an incredibly nationalistic Jew. Very firmly nationalistic Jew. But not a secular nationalistic Jew. A religiously nationalistic Jew. And what Herzl did restore to the Jewish people was a sense of nationalism. And in that sense, he would get some respect from Rabbi Dr. Breuer. While on the other hand, because the nationalism which he defined was something different, he would not. For that, he would get very, very strong opposition. And I will share with you, in that sense of nuance, an idea which he himself shares. You know that there's a chazal, it's a famous chazal, it's found in the Gemara, that the word emes is Aleph Mem Tuf, the first letter, the middle letter, last letter, the first letter of the alphabet, and so on, middle letter, last letter. Emes is great. It goes in progression, it's proper. Chazal say, but sheker is backwards, right? Because the shin should come after the Kuf Resh, not before the Kuf Resh. So, wrote Rav Breuer, he says, but hey, one second, instead of calling, why isn't it Sherek? Then it will be completely backwards. So he said, because good sheker has a kernel of truth in it. There's Kuf Resh, there's a kernel of truth in it. It's just that there's a twist. And that twist, in a certain sense, makes the sheker so much more potent. If it's Sherek, so to speak, if it's completely backwards, then it's mishagas, then it's crazy. But when it comes with a strong idea, and just with a distortion of that idea, that's when it is the most serious and has to be dealt with in that sense as its sheker, as its falsehood. Jewish nationalism. You know, the first time we deal with the issue of Jewish nationalism, if we go back to the Torah, we can remember that there's a parsha of Melech, the Jewish people having a king. They will say, they will come to land and they will see, we will appoint upon ourselves a king who will rule over us like all of the nations that surround us. That's the parsha of the Torah, and the Torah says you'll appoint for yourselves a king. Yet, when we get to the time of Shmuel Hanavi, and the Jewish people actually turn to Shmuel, and they say, your children, not so interested in them succeeding you. Shmuel, you're wonderful, you're the great prophet of the Jewish people, but Banav leholchu b'drachav, his sons haven't gone exactly the same way. And in place, they ask, appoint for us a king, and that king will judge us like all the nations. Shmuel is upset. And you could imagine that Shmuel would be upset. This was a rejection of his succession. However, Hashem says to him, Shmuel, it's not you who they've rejected, it's I who they've rejected. Shmuel's upset itself was certainly also not about just his succession. It was about the statement which the Jewish people were making. And of course, the question is, why were the Jewish people considered doing such a negative thing if there's a mitzvah in the Torah to appoint a king? And you'll say, but they wanted to have a king like all the nations. The Torah in the mitzvah to appoint a king says, you will say, we want to appoint a king like all the nations. They understood it's part of the structure of the nations. So the Ramban has an approach there, where he says the Torah doesn't say you should say it, the Torah says you will say it. And it's sort of a half narrative, half mitzvah. Because in fact, maybe we shouldn't say it. But if we do, this is what should happen. The Ran, in one of his drushos, Drasha Yud Aleph, I believe, the Ran has a completely different approach. And his approach is that if the Jewish people had asked for a king, like all the nations, it would be fine. We need to have a king. But we put in a word that changed everything. And that word was, we asked for a king who would judge us, like in the case of all the nations. And so the Ran explains that the idea is because the true judgment of the Jewish people is supposed to come from the Torah itself. And while there is room for a king, and there's even room for the judgment of a king, the judgment of a king is administrative. It's not legislative. Just like in the separation of powers that we have in American civics. The legislature makes the laws. The administration makes sure that the country runs. If the administration starts to be the judge, then it's no longer truth. In Torah, in the world of the Jewish people, it is the divine law that is the legislature. We're here to be about the Torah. A king? Yeah, a king is needed because you still need to have highways. You still need to have trash removal. You still need to have a defense, an army. You need to have all kinds of things, an economy. The Torah might give you rules, might give you laws, what's right and what's wrong, but it doesn't do infrastructure projects. So therefore, you need to have a melech. But that the melech should be the one deciding what justice is? The melech is supposed to be the one who's carrying around the Torah cradled in his arm all of the time. That's the job of the melech. The job of the melech is to administer, but to be administering a country according to the Torah. and therefore the mishpat should remain squarely in the seat of the Sanhedrin, of those who are charged with the preservation of the Masorah, of the tradition of the Torah. So that request, which the Jewish people made the very first time for a king, was going about this very issue. They were asking for a king that would bring a new kind of nation to the Jewish people, not defined by the Torah as personified by the Navi, by Moshe, Yehoshua, Shmuel, as the leader of the Jewish people, but instead a secular leadership which wouldn't just be there to supplement, but would in fact to some degree supplant leadership on the part of the Torah. A Jewish nation, yes, but a Jewish nation with Torah at its core. That's the tension. That was the tension then the first time the Jewish people asked for a king, and in a great sense, that's the tension that's repeated here. When the Jewish people are going about to restore for themselves a kingdom, a government, and the question is what form it will take. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. You see, you might say that Rabbi Dr. Breuer, this Yitzchak Breuer, was rejecting completely the approach of his grandfather. Rav Hirsch said, we shouldn't be doing this at all. We're supposed to just do tshuva and wait for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to take care of us. Well, Rabbi Dr. Breuer clearly saw two things as being significant. One, what he describes in his own writings, different than the Shalosh Shvuos, the 3 oaths of the Gemara. Because he said, look what Herzl was doing. Herzl wasn't waging a war. Herzl wasn't suggesting that the Jewish people would go and conquer Palestine. Herzl was going and asking the world to give the Jewish people a homeland, to give them a place. He was asking it from a sense of justice. He was asking it from a sense that the Jewish people will not be able to ultimately find their home here. He was asking for it. He wasn't waging war over it. Is that a violation of the principles? Well, of course, as you know, Rav Kalischer also was not waging war. But nevertheless, Rav Shamshon of Hirsch was still opposed. But certainly by the time Rabbi Breuer came around and made Aliyah himself and wanted to make the principal agenda of Agudas Yisrael the establishment proper of a Torah community in Eretz Yisrael, by then there was already license given. He moved to Eretz Yisrael in 1933. His first trip to Eretz Yisrael was I believe, 10 years earlier. There was already license granted. There was already the Balfour Declaration. And so, in a certain sense, quote-unquote, the conquest, on some level, was done. He certainly shifted in that regard. What Reb Shamshon Hirsch would have said, I don't know. He didn't feel he was contradicting the teachings that were there of the past. And he had a tremendous, tremendous yearning and a love for Eretz Yisrael, which he describes and goes on to describe. Eretz Yisrael wasn't just a concept. There was a map of Eretz Yisrael which hung in their room back at home when he was a child. And the tangible love and care for Eretz Yisrael was there with him all the time. But more than that, what he saw Herzl do was to stir and awaken in people the sense that the Jewish people need to be a nation. And let's understand how he saw that transformation, both in terms of then, what was happening, what was changing, and in terms of the gift that in a great sense this transformation actually brought about to the Jewish people. Social emancipation was the alternative to what was happening here. The nationalist movement to be able to take a land in Eretz Yisrael stood at loggerheads with what had been the classic Western European approach for the solution to the Jewish problem. Their solution was, we're going to melt in to the country that we're a part of. Finally, They've knocked down the walls of the ghetto. They're allowing us in. They're giving us equal opportunity. We can now become a part of this society. Herzl looked at the situation, part of that seen as he was, a very, very successfully assimilated Jew in many ways, an important intellectual, writer, editor for the Neue Freie Presse, an important Viennese newspaper, Paris bureau chief for them, or correspondent, or whatever you would call it. But he himself felt that instead of us just being Jews in a foreign land, we instead need to define ourselves, have our own place. We will never meet success melting into this society, melting into this country that's around us. Suddenly, writes Rav Breuer, people began to have an understanding of their place and their value. I'm a Jew, and my place is in the midst of my people. Zionism stopped many people from the final step of assimilation, which would be baptism. To many, it gave them a certain balance, an emotional balance, an ideal balance, a sense of mission, a purpose in life. And it was very simple. All it required was a single decision to acknowledge that there was the nation and to become part of it. Accepting upon oneself the yoke of heaven is more complicated. But accepting to be part of the people, that was something that they could do. Social emancipation, writes Breuer, divided the nation, separated them one from the other. What did they do? Every Jew would become part of his, whichever country he was a part of. The tidings of Herzl renewed and strengthened the sense of closeness. Because in the light of history that Herzl illuminated upon the nation as a whole, all parts of the Jewish people had one shared fate. And that shared fate was Golus, exile. This lot, a nation without a land, without a state, a nation scattered amongst the Goyim, a nation in the land of its enemies. What Herzl taught renewed in people the pain of the Churban, the sense that burned of confusion that the Churban brought into the Jewish people. Our nation is sick. Our nation is in danger. Who could heal it? Just to wait? Like our forefathers waited? Times have changed. Our time gives us new opportunities. And what can stand in the way of will? The will, that's it. There's Yerushalayim down here. Want it, right? Famous statement of Herzl, if you will it, it need not be a dream. In Tirtzu, ein zo agada. Now, isn't this the truth? Doesn't everybody have to view themselves as if it is in their lifetime that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? Have we become accustomed now, over these hundreds of years, to Golus and made peace with it? His idea of the resurrection of a nation before the resurrection of the state. The resurrection of a nation is a nation that sees itself, that wants itself to be a people. And what he saw, what Herzl accomplished, was he brought back into the Jewish people a sense of not just being isolated citizens here and there trying to be part of something else, but a desire to be our own people. In Rav Breuer's formulation, following along Rav Hirsch, that was a very fundamental dream. And I want to take you now to a different essay of his, a different passage of his, another one where he references Herzl. I want to note, if anybody wants to research it further, that Rabbi Dr. Isaac Breuer had a son, Dr. Mordechai Breuer, who was a great scholar and a professor at Bar Ilan, less of an agudist than his father. He wrote both in Hebrew and in English an article about the 4 eulogies on Herzl from an opponent of Herzl, about 4 quote-unquote eulogies that his father, the Agudist, had said and written about Herzl. And so you could find these references in there. But in this article here, in this piece that I want to cite to you, he writes very, very movingly about a Shabbos which he visited in Yerushalayim, his pilot trip with his wife, not in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael, before he went to Eretz Yisrael. It was his second trip to Eretz Yisrael. His first trip to Eretz Yisrael, he went to Tak. He spent all his time in the old Yerushalayim with the Yishuv HaYashan, trying to work with them, to help them in their issues which they were having, negotiating things, and was there firmly as an advocate for the Yishuv HaYashan. The second visit, he spent traveling the land, and it opened his eyes to different scenarios. And he has a magnificent essay where he describes Erev Shabbos in Tel Aviv, as he's there in Tel Aviv, in the streets of Tel Aviv, and a Shabbos is coming, and I'm going to read it to you with free translation. I think you'll enjoy it. He says, "It was then my first Shabbos that we did in Tel Aviv. I saw the wings of the holy day starting to descend and cover this city, this moving city, and slowly but surely silencing it, silencing the noise, silencing the tumult. I saw this clearer than I had ever seen before in the Gola. I saw an old Jew who was running from street to street, holding in his hand a trumpet that he had, according to what they tell me, from the days of the First World War. It wasn't 100 years before, but he had it from the days of the First World War. I saw him stopping at every street corner, taking out the trumpet and making sounds that meant well. I saw, this was the shofar of Erev Shabbos. I saw the skies of our land, that any person who ever had the privilege to see them will never be able to forget them. They're deep blue, rich with mystery, sort of stood like a tent, like an ark over the city. I saw people, Jews, moving towards a large building, and I joined them to go to the Beit HaKnesset HaGadol, to the great synagogue of Tel Aviv. It became filled very quickly. And what a strange group of people. Unusual. You wouldn't see on anybody any kind of special festive Shabbosdik clothing. There's no hint to any kind of homogeneity. There's no sight, anything of some kind of celebration filled with yearning. But Ami, my people. A people gathered from all edges of the world, all mixed up together. A nation that was carried with strength to its birthplace, that had been lost to it for so long. A nation that still carries within it the stamp of its foreign sources, that carries already upon them. In other words, it still carries, so to speak, the impressions of their golus, but is already carrying as well the signs of the hard work of building. And now, with a force of the Spirit filled with mystery that pushes it into this building that was built for the honor of the God of the Jewish people. I look around me in this house of the people of the God of Israel. Aren't its gates open? They remain open because the masses of people can even spill out beyond its gates. They can't fit into the street. The image of this Beis HaKnesses HaGadol of the Beis HaKnesses HaGadol in Frankfurt comes before my eyes, and with a clarity that is instructive, I experience the tremendous contrast between the two. And now listen to what he formulates. Not negative towards Frankfurt, truly not. And not negative towards Tel Aviv, truly not. It's two different things. In Tel Aviv, there is a community of a nation developing, rooted in the ground, still somewhat confused, but nevertheless drawn to the house of the nation of the Jewish people. In Frankfurt, I see a community of Jews controlled by the Torah, however, so limited in its tasks, in its mission, because of the Golus. Melukedes, captured, tested through all kinds of struggles, crowned in victory that was taken with great strength from the enemies of the Torah, despite them. And he goes on, and he says, Tel Aviv is a nation without community, and Frankfurt was a community without a nation. And the idea that he shares is that Frankfurt was a community that was defined completely by Torah. Everything that it was about, the raison d'etre of the community. Why did they even create the secessionist community in Frankfurt? They wouldn't be part of the general community, which was a community which wasn't guided by the Torah. It was a reformed community. They wanted to have a community that would be completely and totally defined and guided by the Torah. But they couldn't be. They couldn't be because they were just a religious community within another nation. The laws of commerce, the laws of society, the laws of the world that surrounded them were not going to be defined by the Torah. And so wrote Rav Breuer, so what were they limited to? They were limited to having the communal enterprises of building a school, building a shul, building a mikveh, providing kosher food. But beyond the confines of religious life, they had no reach. They had no ability to have any impact. That's a kehillah without a nation. And the vision of the Torah is a vision that applies to the fullness of national life. And then we move to Tel Aviv, and we have a nation and the ability to start building something from the ground up, where all the rules of the road, they're all yours, they're all made by you, to be defined by you. And that was, of course, Herzl's vision. We're going to create a country with its own laws, with its own society. It's going to be ours, instead of us living under somebody else's. Except, he looked so happily, so favorably at these people from this nation, and they were moving towards the shul. God was finding a place in their life as the sun was setting on Friday night. But he knew that it was still sort of a group of people that was involved in building. Yadus, the Judaism was there, but it wasn't the defining entity in terms of this. And the vision of Klal Yisrael, of the nation of the Jewish people, in Hirsch's formulation, and in his grandson, Rabbi Dr. Breuer's formulation, was, it's all about the Torah. It's all about the Torah. It's all about the Torah, but all. The Torah addresses every aspect of life. And if you resign yourself to be just observing Torah within a framework of another nation, you've lost your identity as the Jewish people. You've lost the nationhood, the nationalism of the Jewish people. But on the other hand, if you've adopted a nationalism of the Jewish people, and it's not driven by Torah, so then you have also distorted. And as he would say it, as he did say it, and I'll read to you just the words, the way he expresses them, which I think are describing it, his view of this perfectly. From the day of its birth, Zionists showed a face as if it was not going to destroy anything. Please, let the religious be religious, And let those who want to do differently do what they want to do. And let those who want to be secular altogether, let them be secular. All of them can come together to Zion. We'll take the ultra-Orthodox, we'll take the reformers, and we'll take the atheists, the secularists, the communists. Anybody's welcome to join. The same way as space includes everything that becomes part of that space, so too Zionism can include every stream, every part of its people. Nobody should be excluded. And therefore, Zionism, writes Breuer, is not a small change in Yadus. It is a change of the entire sphere, the entire circle, the entire context of Yadus. The space that Am Yisrael occupies is HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His Torah and the meta-history of the Torah. That space truly includes all portions of the people, even those who rebel against the Torah. They also exist within the framework of we're God's people, with God's Torah, and that includes us, whether we listen to what He says or we don't listen to what He says. We're all defined within that circle. Instead, Zionism created a different circle. And that circle was the nation. And the Torah becomes a little subset, a little nucleus within that big circle. And that's a reversal of things. Klal Yisrael exists within the Torah, instead of the Torah being a little subset within Klal Yisrael. He did not claim, like others did perhaps, that Herzl was against the faith. Many originally objected to Herzl being very, very secular. Rav Breuer himself describes the change where he went from finding a dry, simple solution to the anti-Semitism problem, having the Jewish people have their own state, to the point where Herzl became in touch with the Jewish people and realized there was a vision of Zion. And that was beyond practicality. That was something deep and profound. He refers to Herzl as the Navi, the prophet. He doesn't mean that he was, quote-unquote, really a prophet like Shmuel, but Herzl had to have beyond the pragmatic vision. He had to capture the dreams of the Jewish people, the dreams of 2,000 years, the dreams of Zion. There was something significant there, but it was all around the restoration of the Jewish people, with these things as providing some of the soul of it. And for the strict, agudist, clear view of Rabbi Dr. Breuer, there's a little bit of an inversion of the story. Jewish nationalism is a fundamental value. Anything less than seeing the Jewish people as a nation is a vast reduction in the Jewish people. One who ceases to see the Jewish people as a nation should not have a terrible problem in the Golus. We're able to have our yeshivas, we're able to study our Torah, we're able to do our thing, we have our communal life which is controlled by the Torah. So we're a little corner someplace. But the role of the Jewish people is to be a nation that models life for the entire world. Ki mitzion tetzei saro dvar Hashem Yerushalayim is not just referring to the temple worship. It's the temple worship, and then it's Yerushalayim, and then it's the law of a country and the law of a land. These are not my words. These are the words of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. These are the words of Rabbi Dr. Breuer. That's what it's about. To reduce Judaism to just its world of religion and religious practice is taking the Am of the Jewish people, which is a tremendous sacrifice. To restore the Am, but take away the essence, the constitution of the Am, the space into which the Am is to be defined, to take away that identity as the Torah, is equally a tremendous, tremendous distortion of what the Jewish people were meant to be about. So Breuer was a fan. He saw and recognized, and this comes clear in his writing, something which we know until this day. What is the greatest source of Jewish identity for alienated Jews? The state of Israel. The fact that Jewish people can feel to some degree that they belong to a nation. Where would we be with assimilation if there wasn't, heaven forbid, a state of Israel today? The Kiruv program is birthright, to bring people and connect them to their land, to their country. And Rabbi Dr. Breuer saw that and appreciated it even before birthright, so to speak, was a twinkle in anybody's eye. The connection to a sense of nationalism brought Jews who were far away to have something to connect to. But there was still something deeply and profoundly missing from it. That's the nuance, I think, of his approach. He wasn't the devil. He did something. He restored something significant that all of Klal Yisrael, in a great sense, would benefit from. But at the same time, he also brought in something which had in it an inherent distortion of what the Jewish mission was to be about. Jewish nationalism, yes, but Jewish nationalism has a very specific flavor to it. More than that, it has a context to it, has a space which it occupies. And the space which it occupies is HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Torah. So here, after last week where we saw sort of like these two opposites, the Satmarav, absolute opposition. Yes, the irreligious aspect of it nodded him, as he said, but he saw the whole thing as this is a Maisa Satan, this is a negative thing. He's not the Shliach, heaven forbid, of the Rabbeinu Shalom to do this. How could he be? It's going against that such a person should do it, and this is not something which is supposed to happen. We're not supposed to do it with our own hands. And then we saw Rav Teichtal, Deim Abanim Smeichel, who came around to feel, no, this is, and he referred to them as Shliach Hashem, the Malachei Hashem, the messengers of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to clear the way till ultimately everything will come and will come right. Rabbi Breuer saw the combination. Just the stirring of nationalism itself was great. The love of Tzion, the love of Eretz Yisrael to him was something which was deep and profound and strong, but identifying the Jewish people as a nation again, not just as isolated guests in a foreign land trying to find their home there, but restoring the sense of striving to be a nation was the greatness in his mind of Herzl. This piece, boy, did it need to be addressed. Fascinatingly, in one of his essays, Breuer turns and he says, tell us, he says to our Gedolim, tell us, is it Maaseh Satan or is it the act of God? Which one is it? And you see in everything which he says about this person, this sort of complex feeling. Look what he's restored to us. But on the other hand, look what it has changed. That's the complexity of that particular rabbinic response to the impact, to the role of Herzl in Jewish history. We'll continue